Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's story. Before we dive in, I just want to take a moment to say that I believe this is one of the most incredible armed forces stories I've ever shared with you. If you've been following the journey so far, you know I've had the privilege of telling some gripping, spine-tingling tales, but tonight's story truly stands out for me. It's one of those stories that lingers in your mind long after the telling, and I have no doubt that you're going to be just as captivated by it as I was when I first heard it. But before we get into the heart of it, I want to express my gratitude to the brave men and women who serve in our armed forces. These stories, these experiences, these are the people who live through them, day in and day out, often in conditions most of us can't even imagine. To the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who risk everything to protect us, a heartfelt thank you. You are the backbone of our security, and your sacrifice does not go unnoticed. We owe you everything. And with that, let's settle in. Find your spot, take a deep breath, and let the darkness take over for a while. Let go of the distractions, the noise of the day, and immerse yourself in a story that's as real as it gets, one that takes you to the heart of a remote valley in Afghanistan, where things are not as they seem. Now, I'm not the one at the center of this story. This is the tale of my old section sergeant, a man named Benny, who was stationed at a remote observation point during his second rotation in Afghanistan. And I can tell you, Benny's story isn't just a simple account of military life. It's far from that. It's a story that intertwines the brutality of war, the uncertainty of the unknown, and the eerie sense of something larger at play that even Benny couldn't fully comprehend. Imagine, for a moment, being sent to the edge of the world. No, seriously. Think about it. Not just the typical battlefield you've seen in movies, but a place so far removed from the rest of civilization that the air itself feels different. Where every sound seems to carry double, the land is harsh and unforgiving, and time feels as if it moves at its own pace, slow and unyielding. That was Benny's reality. Stationed in the heart of a barren valley in Afghanistan, his team was tasked with one of the most vital missions of their deployment, manning an observation post so remote and so vulnerable that even the slightest error could cost them dearly. Benny's post, located deep within the mountains, was a critical part of the mission, a task that required precision, vigilance, and a sharp sense of intuition. You see, when you're stationed in a location so isolated, with only a handful of men to rely on, the importance of every detail becomes magnified. There's no backup, no quick support coming if things go wrong. You are alone. You are responsible for everything in that small corner of the world. It was brutal, yes, but also necessary. This was their second rotation in the valley, and the team was well aware of the grueling cycle they were locked into. Their purpose was to relieve other sections, giving them much needed rest before the next wave of rotations began. But, as you can imagine, this rest was a rare luxury. Each post had a single mortar attached to its mission. It was their primary weapon, supporting firepower for the whole team, and a means of security in a region where any movement could be a threat. The environment itself didn't make things any easier. The valley's terrain was rugged and unforgiving. A place where one wrong step could send you tumbling down an endless slope or into a ravine. There was no shelter from the fierce winds, and the nights brought cold so bitter it could freeze your breath before it even left your mouth. This was a place where even the toughest soldiers could feel the weight of isolation. To put things in perspective, it was 2018. The situation in Afghanistan had already been escalating for years, and though it wasn't the hotbed of the media spotlight anymore, things were far from calm. These valleys, these outposts, became like isolated islands in the sea of conflict, each one holding its breath, watching, listening, waiting for any sign of danger. And in those valleys, you quickly learned that it wasn't just the enemy you had to worry about. The harshness of the environment, the loneliness, the constant tension, they all conspired to create an atmosphere where every sound could be a threat. Every shift could be your last. But Benny, well, he had been through it all. This wasn't his first rodeo. He knew how to read the land, how to anticipate the enemy, and how to keep his men calm under pressure. What Benny hadn't accounted for, though, were the things that would defy explanation, things that no soldier, no matter how experienced, could ever predict. Benny's station was equipped with a variety of tools to help him see beyond the physical limitations of the valley. A single mortar, an M240B machine gun, these were the tools that he had at his disposal. The gun was his primary weapon, stationed at the blocking position near their mud hut. His job was to secure their position from all angles. Directly to the left, the valley's mouth lay wide open. This was their primary approach. Any movement in that direction could signal an approaching enemy. To the right, just beyond the horizon, lay the vast mountain range stretching into the hazy borderlands of Pakistan. This particular area of Afghanistan had become a hotspot for clashes between various militant groups, and Benny knew that at any moment, things could turn chaotic. But his real test wasn't the visible danger. It was something far more insidious, something that crept up on him and his team, something unseen and intangible. But before Benny could even begin to fathom what was to come, nature itself had other plans. Winds howled through the valley with a ferocity that seemed unnatural, tearing at the flimsy mud huts they'd erected for shelter. For Benny, a Florida native, the storm felt like nothing he had ever experienced before. It wasn't just a storm, it was a monstrous force that seemed to rip through the landscape with a mind of its own. The wind shrieked, tearing across the ground, and the dust swirled up, blinding everyone in its path. It was a scene so chaotic, so violently disruptive, that it seemed almost impossible. Benny swore it felt like a hurricane had struck them, though there wasn't a cloud in sight. The storm raged for hours, taking everything in its path. When it finally passed, an eerie silence fell over the valley. The wind died down, and that's when they saw it. A fog, thick and dense, crept into the valley, like a creeping shadow swallowing everything in its wake. Benny watched in stunned silence as it rolled across the terrain, consuming everything in its path. He even managed to capture it on video, a slow-moving blanket of fog that seemed to have a mind of its own, a suffocating presence that engulfed the entire valley. As the fog settled in, Benny's team found themselves completely blinded. Visibility was so poor that Benny couldn't even see the barrel of his M240B machine gun. Not even the infrared optics, which usually allowed them to spot heat signatures, could cut through the haze. They were completely in the dark, unable to see what lay ahead or behind them. It was a soldier's worst nightmare, total blindness in a hostile environment. They were left with nothing but their senses, and even those began to betray them. The fog lingered for days. 3 long days of uncertainty and isolation. And during those days, something unsettling began to happen. The radios crackled with intercepted messages, encrypted traffic, but nothing they couldn't understand. It was ISIS. The terrorists had somehow managed to infiltrate the area and were aware of their presence. The voice on the other end of the transmission was chilling. "We can't see a thing, but we're going to hit them through the fog tonight." And with that, the game changed. The fog was no longer just an inconvenience. It was a tool, a weapon, a cover for something far more sinister. And Benny knew that things were about to take a turn into the unknown. Benny sat perched at the blocking position near the small mud hut, his fingers gripping the cold steel of the M240B machine gun. The sight in front of him stretched out across the valley, a barren and unforgiving landscape that was both beautiful and brutal in its emptiness. The valley, nestled between towering mountains and shrouded in mystery, felt like it was carved out of the earth for a purpose, though what that purpose was, Benny wasn't entirely sure. His job was simple: watch. And when you're stationed in a place like this, with the weight of responsibility heavy on your shoulders, that watching becomes an almost spiritual experience. He wasn't just keeping an eye on the landscape, he was protecting it. Every ridge, every dark crevice of the valley could conceal a threat. He understood the gravity of his position. Directly to his left, the mouth of the valley was wide open. This was their primary approach, where any hostile forces could make their move. It was the most vulnerable point in their defense, and Benny's eyes were fixed on it constantly, scanning the horizon, waiting for any sign of movement. This area was always at risk, but it also allowed Benny to see far and wide, a perfect vantage point for detecting enemy movement well in advance. The wind would occasionally pick up, carrying dust and debris, but Benny remained steadfast, his eyes narrowing as he watched the valley floor, his senses attuned to every detail. He never let his guard down. Not here. Not in this place. To the right, the mountains stretched into the haze of the Pakistani borderlands. Benny didn't like looking in that direction. It wasn't just the physical distance that separated them from the border, it was the uncertainty. The hazy outlines of the peaks seemed to whisper of hidden dangers, of things that moved in the dark spaces between countries. He had fired high explosive rounds in that direction before, back during a previous mission, when intelligence had suggested that the enemy was hiding somewhere in those mountains. Whether he'd actually hit something, he would never know. The fog of war was a thick one, full of questions without answers. And he wasn't one to dwell on what he couldn't control. Benny's machine gun was the primary weapon of defense for the observation point. The M240B was mounted at a perfect angle to cover a large field of fire. The hillside before him was steep and rocky, a stark landscape that rose sharply from the valley floor. It was a makeshift training ground that the soldiers used to stay in shape, to stave off the inevitable weight gain that came with consuming 4 MREs a day. Training grounds were sparse in such a desolate environment, but they had to make do with what they had. The physical exhaustion that came from scaling the steep incline each day gave them some respite from the monotony. Yet, even this small comfort had its limits. The rough terrain, the endless repetition of training, the isolation, it all weighed heavily on them, day after day. 2 kilometers to the right, another observation point stood like a sentinel on the edge of the valley. It was the only other coalition post in the area, and Benny often found himself wondering about the men stationed there. Were they going through the same exhaustion, the same endless tension? Were they watching the same mountain ridgelines, waiting for the same ominous signs of danger? In the valley, there was no room for distraction. It was a place where survival took priority, and every soldier knew it. But that didn't stop Benny from occasionally wondering what life was like just a few kilometers away. It was on one of these long, tense nights that Benny's world would be turned upside down. The evening began as it always did. The temperature dropped, the winds picked up, and the sky seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. Benny had long gotten used to the shifting patterns of the weather, but tonight was different. It was as though the very air had grown thick with something unnatural. At first, it was just a shift, a quiet change in the atmosphere, a building pressure that seemed to come from nowhere. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. Something wasn't right. Then, it came. The winds hit with such force that Benny nearly lost his balance. It wasn't just a gust, it was a roaring storm, fierce and unrelenting. The wind howled like a beast unleashed, tearing through their fragile infrastructure, shaking the walls of their mud hut as though they were made of paper. Benny's hands gripped the machine gun harder as he braced himself against the chaos around him. The storm ripped through the valley with a ferocity he had never experienced before. It wasn't like the usual dust storms they had grown accustomed to, this was something far more intense. Dust and debris swirled around them, cutting through the air with razor-sharp precision. For a moment, Benny was sure the very ground beneath him would be torn away, swept up in the storm's wrath. His mind raced. What could cause such a violent outburst of nature? Was it a sign of something more, a warning from the earth itself? The storm lasted for hours, relentless in its intensity. And when it finally passed, leaving only a silence that felt deafening, Benny felt a strange sense of unease settle over him. Something had changed, something he couldn't quite put into words. The valley, which had once felt like a static, unchanging place, now felt alive. As if the land itself had woken up, aware of its surroundings. The first sign of this new presence came in the form of fog. Thick, dense, and slow-moving, it crept into the valley like a ghostly tide. Benny watched as the fog rolled in, swallowing everything in its path, obscuring the landscape until he could barely make out the outlines of the hills in front of him. It was so thick, so impenetrable, that even the machine gun's sight seemed useless. He reached for the video camera, capturing the eerie scene as the fog enveloped everything, leaving only a sea of white where once there had been rocky, barren land. Benny's stomach turned. He wasn't sure if it was the storm, the fog, or something else entirely that had caused this sudden change in the valley, but one thing was for sure, things were about to get very strange. He turned to his comrades, exchanging uneasy glances. The fog wasn't just a temporary nuisance. It lingered for hours, for days. Visibility dropped to near zero. Benny couldn't even see the barrel of his machine gun anymore. The temperature dropped, and with it, the tension in the air grew unbearable. They were blind. The valley had transformed into a ghostly expanse, a place where danger could be lurking in every corner, but they couldn't see it. It was a feeling Benny had never had before, not even during the most harrowing firefights. The uncertainty was worse than anything he had ever experienced. For the next 3 days, Benny and his team were left to navigate this thick fog, relying on their ears more than their eyes. They listened for the faintest sound, the crackle of a distant movement, the sound of footsteps too soft to catch with the eye. But despite the paranoia gnawing at them, despite the relentless fog that made even their own shadows seem like threats, nothing came. The days stretched on in a haze of frustration and fear. Then, they intercepted a radio transmission. It was garbled at first, but Benny's seasoned ears caught the words, "They can't see a thing, we're gonna hit them through the fog tonight." The voice was foreign, the language unrecognizable, but the meaning was clear. They weren't just dealing with the fog anymore. They were dealing with something far more sinister. The enemy was out there, waiting, using the fog to their advantage. And Benny knew that their time was running out. This wasn't just another night in the valley. This was the night that would change everything. The strange storm, the thick fog, it was all leading to something. Benny could feel it in his bones. The valley was holding its breath, and so was he. As night descended on the valley, the fog's presence grew stronger, almost as if it were alive. Benny could feel it creeping in, a silent, unrelenting force that enveloped the landscape. It wasn't just a simple weather event. This fog seemed to take on a life of its own, gradually expanding and swallowing everything in its path. It moved without warning, its tendrils slowly stretching out like a vast, suffocating ocean of white. Benny's usual sense of control, the feeling of being able to see and understand his environment, evaporated with the first wisps of fog. What was once familiar, his surroundings, the mountains, the valley, became lost in an overwhelming sea of mist. Standing at his post, Benny tried to pierce through the white expanse with his eyes, but it was as if the fog absorbed all light, turning the world into a void. The barrel of his M240B machine gun, his trusted tool of defense, was inches away from his face. But beyond the dark metal of the barrel, there was nothing. The world had disappeared, leaving only an endless fog that stretched out in every direction. Normally, Benny would rely on his thermal optics to give him the edge in spotting any heat signatures or movement from afar, but today was different. The fog, thick and impenetrable, rendered the optics completely useless. Even the usually reliable infrared sights couldn't pierce through the haze. Benny's heart sank as the reality of their situation settled in. They were completely blind in a battlefield. With no way of spotting enemies or threats, his entire sense of security collapsed. The once crisp, cool air had taken on a heavy, damp quality, making it difficult to breathe. The fog wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a physical presence, a weight pressing down on them. Benny could feel it, the way it dampened every sound, every breath. The cold moisture in the air seeped into their clothes, their bones, and their minds. The whole world felt wrong. It was as though they were trapped in a nightmare, surrounded by an enemy they couldn't see, hear, or touch. His team was also on edge, their nerves fraying as the fog seemed to grow thicker with each passing hour. With no visual cues, no reliable way to assess the situation, every slight sound became amplified. The rustle of a tree branch, the distant howl of the wind, the occasional crackle of the radio, all these sounds became terrifying in the stillness. They could no longer rely on their usual methods for identifying and engaging threats. There was no way to use the landscape to their advantage, no way to gain the upper hand. All they had left were their ears and their instincts, which, in this scenario, were proving to be unreliable. Every creak and crackle of the environment sent Benny's heart racing. Was it the enemy? Was it an animal? Or was it just the fog, making everything seem alive, as if the earth itself was whispering to them? The unknown was suffocating. It was a maddening feeling, not knowing whether there were enemies out there, waiting to strike, or if it was just the haunting sounds of the landscape playing tricks on them. The fog was relentless. Day and night blended together in an endless cycle, each hour indistinguishable from the next. The first night felt like an eternity, and by the time morning arrived, Benny and his team were already feeling the toll of the lack of visibility. They could hear nothing but the occasional distant sound of wind or debris, and the tension in the air only made it worse. The fog lingered, refusing to dissipate. It clung to the valley, pressing in on them from every side. Benny had never experienced anything like this before. They were trapped in a world where time no longer made sense. The fog warped their perception of reality. What should have been a normal night in the field felt like an oppressive, unending test of endurance. As the days wore on, the strain began to show on the men. Eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, voices tense and low, every movement calculated in the desperate hope of spotting some sign of life, some glimpse of the enemy. But there was nothing. Just fog. And silence. The kind of silence that gnawed at their nerves, leaving them on edge and desperate for a break, for something, anything that would confirm they weren't alone. Then, one day, Benny picked up a faint sound over the radio. At first, it was just static, the usual buzz of the transmission, but then, an unencrypted message came through. Benny froze, his heart pounding as the words cut through the airwaves, chilling him to his core. The message was clear, though distorted by the interference: "We can't see a thing, but we're going to hit them through the fog tonight." The realization hit Benny like a punch to the gut. The enemy was out there, hidden in the same fog, just as blind and disoriented as they were. They were not alone. In that moment, the fog became more than just a physical barrier, it became a weapon. The enemy knew they couldn't see, and they intended to use that to their advantage. Benny's mind raced. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing in on him. They had to act fast. The message confirmed their worst fears. The fog wasn't just an obstacle to visibility, it was a trap, and it was designed to make them vulnerable. Benny's team exchanged nervous glances, the tension mounting. But there was no time for fear now. They had to stay sharp, had to stay focused. Benny barked orders to his team, his voice cutting through the fog and the panic. They had to prepare. They had to survive. The fog hadn't lifted, and the silence that hung over the valley was as eerie as it was suffocating. It felt like the entire world had been swallowed by the mist. Benny had just settled into a grim routine, his mind adjusting to the constant unease, when the radio crackled again. This time, the transmission was different. There was no garbled static, no interference. The voice that came through was sharp, urgent, and desperate. We need everything you have, now. The words sent a shiver down Benny's spine. The Afghan commandos, stationed at another position in the valley, were in trouble. This wasn't a routine check-in or a request for supplies. It was a call for help, an urgent, life or death plea. Benny's heart skipped a beat. Without missing a beat, Benny's training kicked in. The fog might have stripped them of their vision, but it wouldn't strip them of their resolve. He snapped into action, his focus laser sharp. The Green Berets, stationed in the fire direction center with Benny, were already moving. They were professionals, accustomed to these kinds of emergencies. Without hesitation, they rushed to the roofs of their huts, shouting for a fire mission. Benny could hear the urgency in their voices as they began shouting orders. The Afghan commandos had provided a precise grid coordinate, a lifeline in the fog. Benny's team knew that every second mattered. The clock was ticking, and they couldn't afford to waste time deliberating. Benny called the shots. There was no time to second guess. If ISIS was making a move, they would strike hard and fast. The team readied the mortars, preparing for the kind of fire mission that could turn the tide of the situation. The air was thick with tension, each man waiting for the go-ahead. Benny's heart raced in his chest as he listened to the voices on the radio, knowing that everything they did now would make the difference between life and death. The fog, still thick and impenetrable, pressed down on them, but Benny knew that they had no choice. They had to make the first strike. They had to suppress whatever enemy forces were hiding in the mist. The Green Berets, ever the professionals, moved with precision, their rifles trained on the fog as they prepared for whatever was to come. The tension was palpable, the air heavy with anticipation. Benny could feel the weight of the moment. This was it. They were about to make their move. The moment Benny had been preparing for finally arrived. The gunners, battle-hardened and focused, were in position. Benny's most experienced gunner, a steady and calm presence, was already loading the mortar. This man had seen countless battles and had earned the trust of every member of the team. He was ready. The first round was launched, its trajectory perfect. The white phosphorus flared to life as it tore through the fog, its explosive light cutting through the mist like a beacon. Benny watched intently as the round landed exactly where it was intended. The explosion that followed was deafening, a violent eruption of light and force that sent shock waves through the valley. Even through the fog, Benny could see the brief flash of the impact, the heat from the explosion sending a ripple through the air. For a split second, Benny felt a surge of relief. They had done it. The strike had hit its mark. But just as quickly as that thought entered his mind, the radio came to life again. The voice on the other end was frantic, almost pleading, again, same spot, more. The urgency in the voice told Benny everything he needed to know. This wasn't just a skirmish. This was something bigger, something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. Without hesitation, Benny ordered the team to double down. More rounds, more firepower. They weren't finished yet. The mortars were loaded once again, and 40 more white phosphorus rounds were sent flying into the fog. Each explosion sent a wave of heat and light through the valley. The hillside began to burn, flames licking at the air, casting an eerie glow that illuminated the fog. Even through the thick mist, Benny could see the distant glow of the fire as it consumed everything in its path. The valley was awash in the fiery light, and the thick smoke made the fog even denser. As the explosions continued, Benny could feel the tension easing slightly. The fire was doing its job. It was disorienting the enemy, suppressing their movement, and creating confusion. Benny's team had struck with precision, and for the first time in what felt like days, they could breathe just a little easier. The enemy was reeling, and they had the upper hand. But then, just when Benny thought it was over, the radio came alive once more. This time, the voice on the other end was different. It was filled with joy, with relief. "You did it. You got her." Benny's stomach dropped. "Her? What do you mean her?" he asked, his mind racing. The Terp, their interpreter, hesitated before relaying the rest of the message. "They're saying, you got the witch." Benny's team exchanged confused looks. "What witch? Was this some kind of joke?" The Terp explained, his voice shaking. "For decades, the locals believed a witch lived on the mountain. She controlled the weather, summoned the winds and fog to torment the valley. The commander is thanking you for finally destroying her." Benny's mind raced. A witch? Had they just been fighting a supernatural entity? What had they really done? As Benny looked out over the valley, the fog began to lift. It was as if something had changed in the air. By the morning, the valley was clear. The fog was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. And for the rest of their deployment, the fog never returned. Benny, now jokingly dubbed Witch Hunter, couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. He petitioned for recognition for his role in vanquishing the supernatural threat, but, of course, the paperwork never went through. But even years later, as Benny retold the story, it remained one of the most bizarre and inexplicable events of his career, a perfect blend of military precision and strange, unexpected mythology. The interpreter's voice was shaky, the words uncertain as he struggled to translate. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by something more hesitant, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was about to say. "They say you got the witch." A stunned silence fell over Benny and the rest of the team. Benny's eyes narrowed, and the rest of the men exchanged looks of utter confusion. "Which? Say again, what was that?" Benny asked, his voice laced with disbelief. The interpreter, still clearly unsettled, took a deep breath before continuing. "They say, for decades, the locals have believed a witch lived in the mountains. She was said to control the weather, to summon the winds and fogs that plagued the valley. The commander of the Afghan National Police is thanking you, all of you, for finally destroying her." The words echoed in Benny's mind, each syllable more absurd than the last. A witch? The locals had believed that a supernatural force had been causing the fog, controlling the very weather that had tormented them. It seemed too far-fetched to be true, yet here they were, getting thanks for something they never even realized they had accomplished. For decades, the valley had been a place of constant strife, with fogs that seemed to appear out of nowhere, suffocating the soldiers and the locals alike. Benny's team had fought through it, completely unaware that their actions had just unraveled a piece of local folklore. They had assumed it was just another mission, another fire support role in the middle of a long and grueling deployment. But now, this mysterious witch was a part of their legacy. The next morning, Benny awoke to a completely different world. The fog that had been so suffocating just hours before had vanished, as if it had never existed at all. The valley, once hidden beneath a thick shroud of mist, was now clear. Benny could see for miles in every direction, the rugged terrain and distant mountains fully visible. It was an eerie feeling, standing in the same spot that had been completely enveloped in fog only hours before. There was no sign of the weather that had terrorized them for days. The atmosphere had changed, the air felt lighter, and for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, Benny could breathe freely. The fog had disappeared as suddenly as it had come. The valley remained clear for the rest of their deployment, without a trace of the mysterious fog that had dominated their lives. It was as though the land had been freed from a curse, and Benny couldn't help but feel a strange sense of pride and accomplishment. His team had unknowingly defeated something much more than an enemy. They had destroyed something supernatural, something that had been tormenting the valley for generations. Word of Benny's victory spread quickly. Soon, he was jokingly called the Witch Hunter by his comrades, a title that would stick with him for the rest of his career. It was all in good fun, but Benny couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary had just happened. What if, in some strange way, the locals had been right all along? What if there had been something to their beliefs? The whole experience left Benny with more questions than answers. In the weeks that followed, Benny even jokingly petitioned for official recognition for his role in vanquishing the supernatural threat. But as is often the case with such strange and unexplainable events, the paperwork was never processed before his term of service ended. The military was focused on real threats, and the story of the witch hunter would become just another bizarre tale, a footnote in Benny's long and storied career. Nevertheless, Benny's time in Afghanistan had forever changed him. He had come to realize that the line between the supernatural and the real world was often much thinner than anyone wanted to admit. The fog, the witch, the strange events, they had all come together to create a story unlike any Benny had ever heard in his years of service. It was a perfect blend of military precision and the unknowable, a tale that would become a legend among his comrades for years to come. Benny's fire mission, while being one of the most successful and intense operations during his deployment, became one of the most bizarre and inexplicable stories to emerge from his time in Afghanistan. It started as a typical mission, a fire support request, the mortar section doing what they were trained for. But what followed, what they discovered after the operation ended, would become one of the strangest chapters of Benny's military career. The mission had turned into a strange fusion of military precision, local folklore, and the unyielding nature of the war they were engaged in. As the reports came in about their success, Benny learned that his team had unknowingly disrupted a piece of local mythology. The witch, a supernatural being believed to control the weather and bring the fog, was not just a myth, but a reality in the minds of the Afghan people. And, despite all the firepower and advanced technology at their disposal, they had unknowingly completed their task by taking out something the locals had feared for generations. It was surreal. For Benny, though, it was just another odd chapter in a career full of strange, unexplainable experiences. Throughout his military service, he had been exposed to situations that defied logic and blurred the lines between the physical and the metaphysical. He had witnessed moments when the normal rules of reality seemed to bend or break, as if the world itself had been altered by forces beyond comprehension. Benny had always prided himself on his pragmatism, on his ability to focus on the task at hand and avoid distractions. He wasn't one to dwell on the unexplainable or get caught up in stories from the locals, no matter how peculiar they sounded. But the events in Afghanistan, the witch, the fog, the strange turn of fate had shaken him in ways he wasn't prepared for. The experience lingered in his mind, a riddle that could never fully be solved. Years after his deployment, as Benny sat down with fellow veterans or shared stories with friends, he often recounted this bizarre sequence of events. He would describe the surreal feeling of fighting an unseen enemy in the fog, the eerie radio transmissions, and the eventual revelation that they had not been fighting just any enemy but a witch, according to local belief. At the time, it had seemed absurd, like something out of a fantasy novel. But as Benny shared his experiences, he began to realize something deeper. He had learned a hard truth during those weeks in the valley. He had learned that the most terrifying and unpredictable things in life aren't always the physical battles on the front lines. Sometimes, the most unsettling moments are those that happen when you least expect them, in the strange liminal spaces in between. Benny had always been prepared for the chaos of the battlefield. He knew the risks, he understood the dangers, and he trusted his training to get him through. But in those moments when the fog had rolled in, when the team had been blind to everything around them, he had felt something else, a profound vulnerability. It was the kind of fear that came not from what was seen, but from what was unseen, the realization that sometimes the enemy isn't just the one you can shoot at, but the one you can't even see coming. He had never imagined that the most terrifying thing he'd face would be the unknown, the invisible forces around him. The fog, the witch, those had been only symptoms of something much deeper. In the field, he learned that fear didn't always come from bullets and bombs. Sometimes, it came from the unknown, from the strange forces that seemed to be at play in the world. Looking back, Benny would often reflect on how this experience had shifted his perspective on the world. The military, with all its precision, training, and discipline, could never truly prepare him for the types of strange, inexplicable events he would encounter. The training taught him how to fight and survive in hostile environments, but it hadn't prepared him for a fight against something he couldn't touch or even see. The witch may have been vanquished, but in Benny's mind, the world was still full of mysteries that would haunt him long after he hung up his uniform. And with that realization came a bittersweet understanding: some mysteries were never meant to be solved. After Benny retired from the military, he thought he had left behind the strange, unexplainable encounters that had followed him throughout his career. He settled into a quieter life, far removed from the noise and chaos of war, or so he thought. But it seemed that the supernatural, the eerie experiences that had become a part of his narrative, would continue to find him, no matter where he went. Benny had always thought that once he left the battlefield, those strange encounters would stay behind with his uniform, but it turned out that the world was far stranger than he had anticipated. One of the most unsettling chapters of his post-service life occurred during a stint in Mexico, where he worked at various military bases. Though Benny had long been out of the field, stationed now in different locations as part of military support operations, the eerie experiences followed him. In one such instance, he found himself posted at a remote base located at the intersection of 3 states, Puebla, Oaxaca, and Veracruz. From the moment he arrived, there was a feeling that something wasn't right. The base was surrounded by dense forests, and rumors of strange beings that inhabited the woods had begun circulating. These beings were said to be elusive, powerful, and sometimes dangerous, something far beyond the ordinary animals that roamed the wilderness. The locals whispered that these beings were not of this world, and Benny, despite his experience in some of the world's most dangerous zones, felt an uneasy knot tighten in his stomach each time he ventured into the woods. At first, Benny brushed the rumors off as mere folklore. He had heard similar stories during his time in the military. Tales of mythical creatures, spirits, and unseen dangers lurking in the shadows were common in many parts of the world. Benny had always been skeptical of such tales. But as the days passed, he began noticing strange occurrences during his patrols. It started with something simple: a circle of stones arranged perfectly on the ground, with pieces of bark and branches in the center, arranged like a small heart. At first, Benny thought it might have been some kind of odd, indigenous ritual, but the precision of the arrangement made him pause. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered strange markings in the wilderness, but this one felt different. It made his skin crawl in a way that no simple object had ever done before. The stones weren't the only strange occurrence. As Benny continued his patrols in the dense forests, he began hearing odd noises. Rustling sounds in the trees, strange whispers carried on the wind, and the occasional cry from an animal that sounded far too human to be real. Benny couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Something that was aware of his every move, even when he couldn't see it. He wasn't sure what it was. His mind played tricks on him in the quiet isolation of the forest, but there were moments when he couldn't help but feel that there was something or someone lurking in the shadows. Despite his growing unease, Benny continued his patrols, trying to dismiss the odd feelings that crept up on him. But the strangeness didn't stop. The more he ventured deeper into the woods, the more unsettling the encounters became. One evening, while on a routine patrol, Benny thought he saw something move in the distance, something humanoid but not quite right. It was human-shaped, standing eerily still behind a tree. Benny froze. His instincts told him to approach, but something about the figure didn't feel right. It didn't move like a person would. It was too still, almost too aware, as though it were waiting for him to make the first move. As he took a few cautious steps forward, a white bird suddenly flew from behind the tree, startling him. The bird's sudden movement sent a chill down Benny's spine, and for a moment, he was paralyzed with fear. He didn't know what he had seen, but he felt something deep in his gut that told him it wasn't just his imagination. Back at base, Benny's comrades told him about the people of the forest, elusive beings that the locals had spoken of for years. No one truly understood what they were, but the general consensus was that they weren't human. Some believed they were spirits, others thought they were creatures from another world. Benny wasn't sure what to believe, but after everything he had seen, he knew that whatever they weren't to be trifled with. As Benny continued his patrols in the dense, eerie woods, his encounters grew stranger and more unsettling. One night, while on perimeter duty, Benny noticed something, or rather, someone hiding behind a tree. It looked human, but something about it felt entirely wrong. The figure was standing unnervingly still, as if it were watching him, waiting for him to make the first move. Benny felt his heart rate quicken. He was trained to confront threats head-on, but this was different. This wasn't just an enemy soldier or an animal, this was something else entirely. He stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. As he carefully crept closer, a white bird suddenly erupted from behind the tree, flying wildly into the night. The bird's flight startled him, but Benny remained alert, keeping his weapon at the ready. What was it? A person? A spirit? He couldn't be sure. But what struck him the most was the feeling that he wasn't alone, that he was being watched by something that didn't quite fit into the world he knew. At base, Benny's fellow soldiers told him about the people of the forest, a mysterious group of beings that were said to inhabit the woods. Some said they were spirits, others believed they were supernatural entities, but no one could say for certain what they were. Each encounter left Benny with a growing sense of unease. He would hear strange laughter coming from the woods at night, an eerie, high-pitched sound that reminded him of the cry of a hyena. But there were no hyenas in the region. Each night, the sounds grew louder, more persistent, as though the very forest was alive with things that were watching him, waiting for him. And it wasn't just the laughter. Benny began noticing strange symbols carved into the bark of trees, symbols that he didn't recognize. Sometimes, he would find abandoned campsites deep in the forest, their fires long cold, and the remnants of rituals long forgotten. It was as if someone or something had been there before him, waiting. Each encounter left Benny with more questions and fewer answers. He had no idea what these people of the forest were or what they wanted, but one thing was clear: they were not to be underestimated. Benny learned quickly that in the dense forests of Mexico, the line between reality and the supernatural was far blurrier than he had ever imagined. Though Benny's time in Mexico had already exposed him to unnerving, inexplicable encounters, nothing could have prepared him for what he would face in Iraq. During one of his deployments, Benny and his team found themselves passing through Camp Babylon, an ancient archaeological site located in the desert. The site was legendary, believed to be the location of the Tower of Babel, and had been the subject of many local myths. Some said the ruins were cursed, others whispered of strange supernatural forces that still lingered there. Benny had always been a skeptic, dismissing such stories as nothing more than superstition. But as he and his team arrived at the site, something in the air felt different. Strange occurrences plagued their time at Camp Babylon. Shadowy figures seemed to dart in and out of the ruins, disappearing before they could fully make sense of them. Benny initially brushed it off as fatigue or stress from the deployment, but others in his unit whispered that something supernatural was at play. The desert had a way of distorting reality, they said. But it wasn't until a disturbing event took place during a convoy that Benny began to question everything he had thought he knew. After a vehicle in their convoy broke down near the ruins, Benny and his comrades found themselves isolated in the eerie silence of the desert. They were on high alert, weapons drawn, scanning their surroundings for any sign of danger. That's when they noticed something strange, a glowing light moving toward the ruins. At first, they thought it was just a reflection, but as they approached, they realized it wasn't. It was a self-contained light, moving with intent, not like anything they had seen before. Benny's instincts screamed at him to investigate, so he and a few others ventured closer. As they got closer, a wailing cry filled the air, a sound that Benny could only describe as full of agony and sorrow. The cry seemed to echo across the desert, sending a chill down his spine. It was unlike anything Benny had ever heard before. The sound resonated deep in his bones, a primal terror that he couldn't shake. As they continued to search the ruins, trying to locate the source of the cry, they found nothing. The wailing continued, growing louder and more desperate. Benny's heart raced. What was this? What could produce such a sound? Then, one of Benny's contractors, frozen in terror, claimed to have seen something standing near the ruins. It was a tall, dark figure, standing motionless and watching them. The figure's presence was overwhelming, suffocating. It exuded an aura of despair that left the men feeling helpless and afraid. But just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished, leaving behind nothing but an overwhelming sense of dread. The air was thick with unease as Benny and his team slowly withdrew from the ruins, their nerves frayed. They couldn't explain what had just happened. The event remained a mystery, an enigma that haunted them all. Months later, Benny's comrades spoke with locals who claimed to have encountered a jinn, a malevolent spirit that haunted the ruins. Benny didn't know what to believe. Was it really a jinn, a supernatural entity from ancient folklore? Or was it something else entirely? What happened at Camp Babylon would stay with him forever, and he knew deep down that some mysteries were never meant to be solved. The encounter with the jinn, or whatever it was, reminded Benny of a terrifying truth: sometimes, the scariest things aren't the ones that can be seen or understood. They're the things that exist beyond the boundaries of human comprehension. And sometimes, the most terrifying experiences come not from what you can fight, but from what you can't explain.